Hello and welcome to Sunday Bible Chat for the last Sunday of the liturgical year, which happens to be the Feast of Christ the King. You will find in my Sunday Bible talk today a reflection on the Feast of Christ the King and its origins, and also a reflection on the primacy of Christ in our lives as Christians. But for my Bible chat, or my Sunday chat, I'm going to focus on the woman on the bus. So this morning, there I was running to Roosevelt. I run as far as the bus stop, then I get on the bus, and then the bus usually carries me to school on time. But this morning I was running a bit late, and so I got on the bus a little bit breathlessly and sat down on the first seat that was available. And it happened to be next to a woman who was on her cell phone. And this woman on the bus was talking very loudly and very heatedly. I'm not sure whom she was talking to. May have been an attorney, may have been a family member. But at any rate, the entire conversation was basically pulling her ex to pieces and trying to prove that he was an unfit father while she was the perfect mother. And the more this conversation went on, the more my head began to spin. I closed my eyes, I tried to tune her out, I prayed she'd get off the bus, but she didn't. And then eventually she did get off the bus, but it was only one stop before my stop. And so by the time I got off to teach, my head really was spinning, and I told my students as I entered the classroom that I needed a few minutes of quiet just to calm myself down so I could teach. But on further reflection, I thought about this woman on the bus and realized she was very familiar. In fact, she's familiar because I think she is every woman, every person, every human, that we all have our own stories that we tell over and over again, stories which have to do with our egos being assaulted, stories which have to do with hurts we've experienced, stories which somehow we cling to and rehash over and over again, sometimes modifying a few details here and there, at others just carrying on and trapping anyone who will listen to us. And these stories we carry with us for years, and we carry them, whether it's 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 years, 50 years, we carry these stories because we have not yet learnt to forgive, because we have not yet learned to move on, because we have not yet moved to acceptance. So instead we tell these toxic stories and we spread our toxicity amongst any people who happen to be around us. They too may try to cover their ears and move out of range, but we trap people with our storytelling. And then the irony is we don't really feel any better for having told the story. The more we tell it, the more addicted we are to telling it, and the less satisfied we are. For Christians, this means that we are actually living at an instinctual level instead of at a spiritual level. Because if we were living the Christ life, and I'm including myself here, if we, myself included, are living the Christ life, then we will jettison these stories that are somehow tokens to our wounded egos. We would jettison the stories and instead spread positive messages of love and forgiveness and tolerance. And instead of criticizing others and telling stories about their failings, we would rather hold them up. And instead of critiquing, we would empower, we would encourage. That would be putting on Christ instead of putting on the ego. So the more I think about this woman on the bus, the more I realize that we go through life, too many of us, too much of the time, living at an instinctual level. And so on the Feast of Christ the King, I feel the invitation is to live a little differently, or rather to live radically differently, so that instead of telling these stories of how we've been wounded, victimized, etc., instead we find stories to share that will uplift others and empower them, as I said, stories that will spread goodness and truth, beauty, but not these negative stories that basically pay homage to our egos. On the Feast of Christ the King, the challenge is to become the Christ. And this means seeing with his eyes, and speaking with his voice and reaching out with his hands, and leaving behind all that is egotistical and narcissistic, all that is about us, about me, and rather moving into a we consciousness, a consciousness of our brothers and sisters in need, a consciousness of those people whom perhaps we have ignored, the people we walk past on the streets, when they're asking for funds or money or whatever else they're asking for. That there's so many people we pass by each day, but we're distracted by our own ego needs, our own hunger for security, our own concerns and limited beliefs and limiting beliefs. But on the Feast of Christ the King, the call is to have a different kind of consciousness, and that is the consciousness of Christ. So that is my reflection for today, and I will join you on the first Sunday of Advent, which happens to be next week. And so until then, happy Thanksgiving to you. May you have much to thank God for, and may we be generous in terms of how we respond to the needs of others.